Hi, everybody. So, have you ever been in a situation where you've had to hold other people to strict standards? Maybe as a teacher, or I see we have mostly students here, but some people do it as parents, maybe as a supervisor, maybe just with a friend. You hold somebody to strict standards, and it takes a lot of strength and power to do that. And to not give in, not allow yourself to be manipulated. But if you're thinking about that, what about mercy? What about showing mercy? Is mercy a sign of weakness? Is mercy a sign of giving in? Maybe it could be sometimes. But what I want to talk about today is how Pope Francis draws upon the work of Thomas Aquinas to make the claim that mercy is very connected with God, who is the source of all power. And in fact, that mercy is the greatest manifestation of God's being all-powerful. Now, the Summa Theologiae is one of Thomas Aquinas' great works, and it's one of the very most important works in the Catholic intellectual tradition. And it was written in the middle of the 13th century, and Pope Francis draws upon the Summa Theologiae of Thomas Aquinas very frequently when he talks about this theme of mercy. And I'm going to try to explore a bit of a pattern that I find there, is that he draws upon St. Thomas to back up a certain vision of the church, and that this is a vision of a church that is very inclusive, a church that accompanies people, a church that's patient with people, a church that has a special concern for the poor, a church of mercy, a church that's hesitant to judge and quick to offer forgiveness. This theme of mercy we find very frequently in the works of Pope Francis. And he even declared a Jubilee year of mercy a couple of years ago, a Jubilee dedicated to the theme of mercy. Now, Jubilee years come every once in a while. It could be every 50 years. In the Old Testament, they had these Jubilee years, and they would be years where debts would be forgiven, prisoners would be set free, slaves would be set free. It was kind of like resetting the clock, and it was a time of starting fresh. I want to tell you a personal story. This goes back to a Jubilee in the year 2000 that was called by Pope John Paul II, Pope St. John Paul II. And during this year of Jubilee, well, my wife and I, we were raising our 4 boys. They were born about 2 years apart from each other. And the eldest son, Thomas, was in a lot of trouble. Mercifully, I don't remember the details of everything that he did. You know, even though we raised 4 boys, there's a lot of things that we've been able to repress and forget. But at that time, he was grounded for 6 months. He owed us $600, and it was very tense in the house. And somewhere between my wife and me, we came up with the idea that on Easter Sunday of the Jubilee year, out in the parking lot after Mass, we told our son Tom that we forgave him, and that for this one time only, we forgave him the $600, and that he was no longer grounded. Well, we didn't hear much about this from him, really, for a long time. It's maybe about 12 years later. I'll tell you more about that at the end of my talk. But until that time, when I mention Thomas, I'll be speaking about St. Thomas Aquinas, not my son Thomas. But so when Francis put out his papal bull, you know, his declaration, it doesn't mean anything like you should think about contemporary meanings. This papal bull on announcing the Jubilee year, he drew upon Thomas Aquinas for one of his most significant points. He says, it's proper to God to exercise mercy, and God manifests being all-powerful, particularly in this way. Now, in the Summa Theologiae, Thomas Aquinas raises objections that other people would most likely have to points that he's making, and then he replies to those objections. And he raises the objection, is mercy a sign of weakness? And he answers, oh, no, mercy is not a sign of weakness. And in fact, a person has to be a person of high authority in order to even be able to give mercy. If you're a subordinate, you can't do it. You just have to follow the rules. And that in the case of God, God is all-powerful. God doesn't have to worry about people thinking that God is weak. And yet mercy is one of the things that is most characteristic of God. It is God's greatest attribute. It's the sign of God being all-powerful. And that Thomas Aquinas reminds us that all of creation and our very existence depends upon God's generosity. It's not a necessity, it's not a justice, it's God's generosity and God's merciful love. So I want to mention a few more points where Francis draws upon the Summa Theologiae of Thomas Aquinas to make points that help him express his vision of the church. And first, Francis emphasized that the church is not primarily a bunch of rules and regulations, but it's a community that lives out the love of God. And Francis notes how Thomas says that Christ and the apostles passed on very few precepts or rules to the early church. And that, and here Francis is quoting Thomas, quoting St. Augustine, that those that are added later should be put forth moderately so as not to burden people, because Christianity is not supposed to be a religion of servitude. Rules and regulations have their importance, but deeper than that is the Holy Spirit flooding our hearts with love and prompting us to act out of that love that is in our hearts. And as St. Thomas put it, God's mercy has willed that we be free. After freedom, a second point for which Francis relies upon Thomas is the meaning of Christian love. And here he draws upon the Summa for 2 points. First, that Aquinas says that when we love someone, in a certain sense, we love them as being one with ourselves. And a second point is that when we love someone, it helps to get us beyond having standards of beauty that are merely on the surface. But when we love someone, we can see a beauty that's much deeper and that is connected with goodness and justice. And Pope Francis takes these two ideas from Aquinas and he points them in the direction of a church that takes the option for the poor. And the option for the poor is not something that is against those who are better off. The option for the poor is something that is in the interest of everyone in the community, that we have a special concern for those among us who are poor or struggling. And Francis says, drawing upon Thomas, that he says that we need to be able to recognize the beauty of the poor, and we need to be able to love them as if they were another self. And when we love them, we can appreciate them as being people of esteemed value. And in this way, Francis tells us, the option for the poor is not just some political ideology, but the option for the poor is a way of living out Christian love, Christian charity. Now, after freedom and love, a third point that Pope Francis emphasizes is patience. We all need to be patient with one another. Francis draws upon Thomas to make the point that a person can have faith and charity and still be struggling with living out some of the other virtues. And even the greatest saints, even after their conversions, they tell us of the struggles that they have remaining, both spiritual and moral. And so that we're not supposed to look at people who are struggling, who maybe aren't living the so-called perfect life, and just dismiss them as horrible sinners. Pope Francis endorses what he calls a principle of gradualness. He says we need to walk with people, we need to accompany people in a way that is respectful and patient. And we accompany them along a path of spiritual growth, that most often things don't happen overnight. There can be a long path of spiritual growth for people. I want, finally, to use an example from a difficult issue that Pope Francis addressed in his document, Amoris Laetitia, which was on marriage and family. And here he addresses this question about those who are divorced and have been civilly remarried. And he says that he doesn't intend to change Catholic teaching about marriage. He doesn't want to do away with the indissolubility of marriage. He's not changing the rules. He doesn't want to make for easy exceptions to things. He doesn't say anything goes. Quite otherwise, he stresses that divorce is an evil and that the increase in divorce is very troubling. But he says still, the situation of those who are divorced and civilly remarried needs to be addressed in a pastoral way. And he draws here upon a distinction made by Thomas Aquinas. That Aquinas says, on the one hand, you've got pure science, like speculative intellect. And on the other hand, you've got practical reason. Practical reason connected with prudence, what works out in everyday life matters. And he says, when it comes to science, even when you get far away from the original first principles of a science, exceptions prove to be a problem. Exceptions are things that you have to account for, and in fact, you may have to redo your whole experiment. You may have to redo your presuppositions to account for exceptions in pure science. But Francis, drawing upon Thomas for this distinction, says that in practical matters, the further you get away from first principles, the more you go in the direction of particular cases, the more it's likely that legitimate exceptions are going to arise. And when it comes to those who are divorced and civilly remarried, he says that, say, the pastor needs to walk with them, needs to listen to their story, does not need to excommunicate them or act as though they're not members of the community. And Francis says that one thing that needs to be done is to make the process of annulment more accessible. But he says also, he says that in some cases, when you hear the story, when you realize the situation, in some cases, it might be, let's say you have a couple who have been together for a few years and they're raising several children together. He says it might be much worse to pull that situation apart than to support it and to see what good is there, even if in the big picture there are things that are not perfect or even highly inadequate. But Francis says no one should be condemned forever. And so we see this pattern that emerges when we examine how Pope Francis is using the work of St. Thomas. We see this pattern that he wants a church that's not reducible just to a church of rules and regulations, but in which people are free. And he wants a church in which people love each other and love especially the poor and those who are struggling and do that in a real way. And he wants a church in which those who are struggling are accompanied respectfully and patiently. Francis does not want a church whose main characteristic is that it is harsh and judgmental. He wants a church of mercy that is hesitant to judge and quick to offer forgiveness. So this point brings me back to the story about my son Tom. I didn't hear much about this from him for about a dozen years. So remember, originally this takes place in 2000 in the parking lot after Mass. So in the meantime, in the year 2010, his fiancée went through the RCIA with him. He was her sponsor. She became a Catholic. They were married in 2011. They now have 3 children who are also my grandchildren. But it was about 2012 that we had a family gathering, and he said, "Oh, Dad, I've been meaning to tell you." He says, "Back when Andrea and I went through the RCIA, we were asked to share a moment from our faith life that really strengthened our faith, something that we could point to and say, yeah, that's a place where my faith became real for me." And Tom said that he told the story of Easter 2000, how after Mass in the parking lot, his parents said to him that, well, this is a Jubilee year, and they forgave him. And even though he was grounded for 6 months and he owed them $600, they said, we cancel the debts. You know, we start fresh from here. And then he said, he told his RCIA group, he said, forgiveness, it's so powerful. Thank you.